Acum, de reacturi. Să vedem. Se încarcă. Hunters. Pe YouTube aveam o tonă de chestiuni. Watch later. Ia. Să vedem scurte. Pagina asta. După... Ia. Să vedem ce.
The thing I really enjoy about programming is just the fact that you really can tell the computer exactly what to do, and it will do what you tell it and nothing more. I don't know, maybe I'm autistic or something, or borderline, but that doesn't happen in normal life. I'm Linus Torvalds. I'm mainly known for being the guy who started and still maintains Linux. The first computer I used was my grandfather's Commodore VIC.
LOL. Față subtă avea față de cum e acum.
I think I was 11 or 12. The computer used a very traditional language called BASIC. My sister says that the first thing I showed her was the one that everybody starts with when you're doing BASIC is 10 print, and you print a string, and 20 go to 10, and that's basically saying print that string forever. She claims that I made it right out, Sara is the best, which to me sounds very unlikely because we weren't necessarily always the best of friends, but maybe I was trying to be nice and impress her with my programming skills. It didn't start out very serious, but by the time I was 15, that was what I did. You see code, you don't have to even think about it. You look at something and you know what it does. If you're not a programmer, you would think it's almost noise. But if you've been doing it a long time, you can read it like any other language. You can write code that looks beautiful, but just doesn't actually solve the problem, which is why I'm still doing the same project 25 years later. It's because it's hard to write.
Hai că se vede bine în chat.
They had a licensing agreement for. Anyways, this bundle was referred to as
Avea. Drăguțel. N-am ce zice. El video nu zice pe mai mult, foarte multe. Next. Avem un scurt. Hai mă, că mereu am fost curios. Care-i faza mă cu astea? Știu că a fost trupa aia, Veronica asta. Așa.
They're pop princesses with punk attitudes. Lisa and Jessica Origlasso, better known as the Veronicas, say it and sing it like
Stai, cum?
Jessica Origlasso, better known princesses with punk attitudes. Lisa and Jessica Origlasso, better known as the Veronicas.
Hai așa, o secundă. Secundă. Ia mă. Oho, ce bucăți. Wow. Bucăți bune. Să nu mă acum aștept. Lisa și Jessica Origliaso. Ok. Păi și de unde a venit The Veronicas? E? De unde vine numere? Jessica Origliaso. Că sunt cei ani 1984. Headers. Ok.
Say it and sing it like they see it. There's no nonsense with the identical twins, who quite remarkably have been stars of Australian music for almost 2 decades now. However, what you might have noticed recently is that you haven't noticed them. They've been uncharacteristically quiet. Sadly, there's been heartbreak at home. But Lisa and Jess have been around long enough to know the show must eventually go on. And that's exactly what they're now doing. They're queens of the quirky, some might add skimpy, costume. It's been a while since Lisa and Jess Oraglasso pulled on the latex. 6 years on from their last studio album,
helicopters flying over you and it's all frantic, but you don't give a shit.
the cameras are rolling on their new music, and the Veronicas want the world to know they're back.
This has been our creative baby for years now. We have this huge
Ce s-a întâmplat,
amount of
mă, cu ele?
music, and I think it really
Heartbreak at
encapsulates
home.
who we are as artists. It's exciting to get it out to the fans.
Nu, să transferați.
Amazing. No, that was awesome. Incredible.
For the Oraglasso sisters, this is the calm before the storm of pop publicity. A welcome afternoon of anonymity on the river in their hometown, Brisbane. How are your sea legs out on the water? Could you ever do like a Veronica's cruise ship season?
Would love to. Us singing, you know, old classics in the corner.
Jazz versions of Untouched.
Brisbane is not just where Lisa and Jess grew up, it's where they made their other name as the Veronicas. 15 years ago, they were booked for their first Australian gig at the iconic Tivoli Theatre. Are things looking familiar now that you're back?
Yeah. It's so grand.
Yeah, it is a beautiful space, isn't it?
Yeah, I remember the first thing that we thought when we first came into this venue, how many people are going to be in here? Like, how many, like, souls are up there too?
There's a lot of space to fill too.
Yeah, it's a huge space. I remember thinking, I can't believe we've sold this out. This is insane.
Do you remember those jitters?
Oh, yeah. Still get them. We still get them every show.
Not that you'd know. In front
Păi,
of
Show.
asta
not
e...
that you'd
Stați așa. Știu live-ul ăsta în zona aia. Dăm pe titles, live. Passion World Tour.
What does In think? I mean, frankly, In, you are not needed for this. You need a good amount of wood for this kind of project, but if you use higher quality logs,
Ia. Veronica's Untouched Live. Că am scris. Pam. În aer liber. Asta. Nu e alt. Oh, nu e alt loc ăsta.
you'd know. In front of thousands of fans, the Veronicas are clearly in control. It seems love kills butterflies.
We always say we would choose to together doing this. I'm her biggest fan. I think she's the most incredible songwriter, amazing artist. Like, I feel so lucky that she's in my band. I'm always like, oh, she's in my band. Like, I feel like that about you too.
I feel like a bit of a third wheel here, guys. It's hard not to feel like an outsider in the company of the identical twins. But an afternoon with Lisa and Jess quickly reveals how close the sisters really are.
I like how you can just sing on cue like that.
There are plenty of compliments.
Wow, your makeup looks so good. Really? Thank you, babe.
But also a healthy sprinkling of sibling rivalry. Who is the lead singer here?
It depends who you ask. If you ask the public, it's me.
Right.
The public being your opinion. Yeah.
Lisa and Jess were fresh out of their teens when they released their first single in 2005.
De așa.
A healthy
What?
twins has been both a joy and a frustration.
She actually cried for a week when I got my leg tattooed. I was like, why would you do this? Very upset about it.
Ce se aude așa diferit deodată?
Why did that upset
Oh,
you
gata.
though?
I think when Jess went and did something that her so far
Ciudat.
physically apart from me, of course I took it personally.
Oh.
She became triggered. So much of my identity growing up was being a twin. I mean, people literally, they didn't even bother learning our names at school half the time. It was the twin.
While a studio or a stage has been their home for most of their careers, 18 months ago, the sisters returned to their real home in Brisbane for a more important job, caring for their sick mum, Colleen. Your mum's diagnosis came 5 years ago?
It's about 5 years. Yeah. So she was diagnosed with a rare neurological condition called progressive supranuclear palsy.
What? Progresiv supranuclear palsy asta. Urât. Fuck. Double fission. Da.
Your hair's lovely. It's quite a rapid decline, so someone will go from being a happy, healthy person and within 2 years be rendered to a disabled position. She can no longer walk, has difficulty with speech, thinking, or movement, swallowing, and it's very confronting to see someone who has been so strong their entire lives be affected by something like that. I think grieving is, you know,
Cum se uita
incredibly
asta la ele, bă?
difficult. When you're grieving someone that's still alive, it requires a unique perspective. We're so lucky that we're here and we're close to home and we can go.
Să schimb categoria aici, să schimb categoria. Chatting. Just chatting. Acting. Chatting. Just chatting. Așa. Da.
Go in and we cook her all her favorite foods and we play all the music she loves and, you know, yeah, get to create those memories.
Sadly, early last year, Colleen's condition deteriorated and she's now in palliative care.
I don't know if there are words to
Ce de
describe it
papagalul.
because you could never imagine seeing someone that you love be in so much pain and to suffer so greatly, but we do our best to try to make her as comfortable as possible and be the women that she would be so proud of.
Colleen has been such a big part of their success. Lisa and Jess call their mum the third Veronica. It was Colleen who encouraged her daughters onto the stage as small children. What are your memories of your very first performance?
Our very first performance, we were in red leotards, aged 5, and we were singing Do Re Mi. I was picking my nose. You were forgetting.
I forgot the dance moves.
Your dance moves. I think we were singing in tune though.
Yeah.
So props
What?
to us.
Their earliest concerts were in the suburbs of Brisbane, where they took to the stage whenever and wherever possible. And all that performing paid off when music executives at Warner Brothers in the US noticed and then signed them onto an extraordinary $2 million deal.
Signing our Warner
BBC.
right now. So it's exciting.
We were signed by Seymour Stein, who's the grandfather of punk rock. He signed the Ramones, he signed Madonna. I just remember being really excited and thinking, yeah, this is what we always said we wanted to do, and we're here doing it.
Now, if it
Adesso
seems
ma
as
peste
if the
noapte devi
Veronicas
milionar.
make
Nu devi
success
milionar
look
muncind
simple,
ca
the
bugetar.
reality is they've had their share
Ca
of pop star stumbles.
sclavete la corporații.
In 2019, accused of being high-flying divas, they were escorted off a Qantas plane after a dispute about baggage. But their biggest challenge came when one of their love lives almost ruined their work lives. Jess's troubled relationship with actor Ruby Rose not only stopped the music, it also
Mai și
stopped
lesbiancă?
the sisters talking to each other. There was a period there where things weren't so rosy for the two of you, where you didn't speak for a year, was it?
Yeah. You know, when you have a twin, you've got like backup for everything. But sometimes to evolve as an individual and to find the love for myself that I needed to find, I needed to just go through that experience for myself.
How did you cope that year?
I don't know.
Oh,
that
dacă de
there's any
scriptat
word
mi se
how
pare,
hard that
bă,
was.
mă doare capul când văd chestia
I
asta.
think it was
heartbreaking.
confusing, and I think that she's my best friend, so just not being able to reach out and
Ah, nu-mi place. Ah. Next. Oh, la 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 la. Ia mă să vedem. Ce-am făcut. Asta de alu Dave's Garage.
When we use a modern computer, we're standing on the shoulders of giants
O, ce
so tall
calitate.
that the details are obscured by
4K.
clouds. It's just far too
Are și
complicated for
saburi
any
de la
one person
oficiale.
to truly understand at any level of detail. But that wasn't always the case.
Da, bă, ești nebun.
Today in Dave's Garage, we're getting medieval with an old computer to investigate some of the most basic technologies that we all overlook in our daily computing.
Are
Things that
aproape
you should
milion,
know
ok.
how they work, but you probably don't. We're going back in time to revisit some of the details that we all take for granted today. You might know how a keyboard works, but do you know how the system scans 100 or more keys with just a few I/O lines? Do you know when and why a computer designer might favor static RAM over dynamic RAM? Do you know how the most basic green phosphor monitor actually puts text characters on the
Ia mă, că sunt
screen?
interesante astea,
You
că
know
nici
how
eu
to
nu le
add
știu.
floating point numbers in assembly language? Well, in about 15 minutes, you're going to know all of those things and a lot more, so stick around.
Ia.
Hey, I'm Dave. Welcome to my shop. I'm Dave Plummer, a retired operating systems engineer from Microsoft, going back to the MS-DOS and Windows 95 days. And today, we're taking a deep dive into an old
Bă,
machine.
dar jur că arată mai bine acum decât... Bă, înainte zici că era Mr. Beast să mor eu. Băi, de semăna cu Mr. Beast.
Windows 95 days. And today, we're taking a deep dive into an old machine in order to go back to basics and make sure that you know how a computer actually works. I don't mean in general. I mean the details, like when the machine boots, what's the first instruction that it executes, and how does it even know where to find that? How does a character definition in memory become a picture of a letter on a screen? The basics. I've been doing this long enough that I can remember the days when you could, for all intents and purposes, know all there was to know about a particular system. It's an awesome feeling, really, and it's a luxury that's pretty much disappeared in modern computing, and I think young developers in particular are worse off because of it. Dave Cutler once said of Windows that it was so big, so much code, that no one mind could comprehend it all. And that was 30 years ago, in 1992, when it was literally about 1/10 the size that it is today. And he was the chief architect. I'd say that MS-DOS on the IBM PC was about the last time that one mind could comprehend the whole thing. But it was never true for me personally. Though I worked on MS-DOS itself and wrote a lot of x86 assembly for it, I stayed pretty much entirely on the I/O side of things with disk compression and copying and caching, so I knew a lot about a little slice of the system. Then I moved to Windows NT, where, again, I knew a lot about a few pieces, but had only a general knowledge of components that I never touched, like audio or printing. The last time I think I knew a whole system inside and out would be the 8-bit days, working on Commodore hardware like the PET and C64. Now, I do not claim to know everything there is to know about a C64, for example. While there's nothing in the programmer's reference manual that would likely surprise me, I'm sure there are lots of weird edge cases for behaviors on the SID and VIC chips that I've never even heard of. Nor do I mean that I know more than...
SIG chips, ce să stea? SIG chip. Și vid chip. VIC, pardon, cred că se cheamă. Video interface chip. MOS tehnologie. Diagram. Malumat. I option. The fuck so? Light pen. Ce mă? Bă. Cine băie pe asta? Că asta n-am mai văzut niciodată. What the fuck?
Anyone else. I'm sure if Jim Butterfield and I were on Jeopardy together and the category was the Commodore PET, I'd only win by virtue of the fact that Jim died 15 years ago now. For me, it's not about knowing every obscure piece of technical trivia, but rather, it really boils down to knowing how every aspect of the machine works so that you can explain each part without hand-waving. For example, when you press the down arrow key on a PET, a lot happens. It's not enough to know that there's a function called carry in that you can call to retrieve whatever the character code is. Because ideally, you should be aware that there's a keyboard scan using multiple chips on the motherboard, ROM routines to handle the screen editor, zero-page locations to keep track of the current cursor position after updating screen memory, and kernel functions that you should know that control all of it. And that's just for one key on the keyboard. So you may not know every detail, but when you have a firm grasp of the big picture, the details that you do know can be seen in context. It's clear then that I can't tell you everything there is to know in 15 minutes. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to paint you a mental picture of the PET, just like AOL used to download images from the web. A blurry overview at first, and then progressively refining the details as the picture comes into view. I absolutely guarantee that when we're done, you're going to understand a computer at a completely new level. Not a guarantee. If I'm successful, then by the end of this episode, you'll have a much crisper picture in your head of not only what a simple computer is made up of, but also how it works. But which computer? I was tempted to do the Commodore 64, due in no small part to its massive popularity. But between sound and video, there's just enough going on there that I don't think I could do it justice in one episode. So I'm going to go one step even further back, as I hinted, to the Commodore PET, which is very much like the C64 but without the fancy sound and video hardware. Otherwise, the machines are remarkably similar and even largely compatible with one another. Almost everything I say about the PET will be true of the C64 as well. Sure, the screen memory and other things move around in the memory map and so on, and the video is totally different, but most of the PET architecture survives on directly in the C64. Now, if your brain works anything like mine, it helps to have a mental overview of the whole machine. I'm going to give you two visuals with which to anchor your knowledge: the system memory map and the motherboard itself. Let's start with the motherboard. I took this photo of my very own PET, and I added labels to what I think are the important parts. At the top, we have the CPU and the I/O chips, and in the middle are the ROMs, and at the bottom, the system RAM. There's no sound chip and no video chip. But clearly there's some video circuitry of some kind because it has a crisp 40x25 character display. So how do they do that? How does a simple computer even display characters on a screen? It's not magic, so how do they accomplish it? Well, it's both simple and genius. As programmers, the part we care about the most is the character generator ROM, the heart of the system. They call it a character generator, but it's simply a ROM with circuitry to point the source of the electron gun at the right place in that ROM. There's no special fancy hardware to create characters, no sprites, no special effects. Each character on the screen is just an 8x8 grid that is effectively copied directly from the ROM to the screen, with the beam on when the bit is set and the beam off when the bit is clear. But how does it copy the character to the screen? Well, it simply looks at the right place in a particular ROM for the bytes that define what the character looks like. In other words, the job of the video hardware is really to point the electron gun's source at the right bit in the character definition in the ROM. Then whatever pattern it is in the ROM will be lit on the screen phosphor. As the electron beam scans, the current XY position determines which byte of screen memory is being displayed. Working within the margins of the 40x25 screen, with each character cell being an 8x8 grid, our actual resolution is thus 320x200. The hardware fetches that byte of screen memory, and let's say it's the letter E, which is the screen code 5. That means that the letter E is the 5th entry in the character ROM. Every letter is an 8x8 monochrome grid, meaning that each letter takes up 8 bytes of 8 bits in that ROM. Thus, to find our offset in the character ROM table, we simply take the character code and multiply it by 8. And then here's the genius part. They simply take the lower 3 bits of the current scan line, and that's how many bytes deep you are into the character definition. Let's look at a concrete example. The letter E in the top left corner of the screen. We start at scan line 0. When the electron gun reaches the left edge of the character, we need to fetch the byte from ROM that corresponds to the first or top byte of the character definition. Since the code for E is 5, we multiply by 8 bytes per character to get the 40th byte in the ROM. Since we're on scan line 0, we don't have to index in any further, and hence, we fetch the bytes directly. The bits are then clocked out to the gun from highest to lowest, which is left to right in the character definition. It's ironic that despite all of its simple elegance, there's one glaring design shortcoming in the PET that I've never understood. The character ROM is fixed. Had they allowed you to specify a location in RAM as the base address of where the video circuitry went to look for in memory for the character definitions, you could define your own characters. Each of the 256 characters is in its own little 8x8 bitmap and can be reused on the screen as often as you like. This is how the C64 works, and along with sprites and smooth scrolling, it's one of the graphics technologies that allowed the 64 to become a gaming phenomenon in its day. But it's curiously absent on the PET. Imagine you wanted to find a custom character, like the copyright symbol. If it were possible, you would simply copy the existing character data from the ROM to somewhere in RAM, and then you would modify the definition for your special character by replacing a character like the back arrow, perhaps, and it becomes the copyright symbol. Then you modify the base address of the character table to point to your customized copy. You can customize as many or as few as you like, and it would also be trivial to load a custom character set from disk. Changing fonts would be one load command and 2 pokes away.
Okay.
Now, I'm not a hardware guy, so I don't know how much it actually saved them in circuitry, speed, or complexity to have the character ROM effectively dedicated to the video circuit lookup on the PET. The ROM is only even wired up to the video circuit and isn't exposed to the CPU or present in the memory map. In other words, you can't get there from here. If you have a theory as to why they couldn't let the video circuitry pull character definitions from RAM instead, please let me know in the comments. My best guess at this point is that the character definitions take up 2K, so perhaps on a 4K machine, it just wasn't practical enough to be a big priority. But you could write some killer games on a 16K PET had it allowed for custom character bitmaps. One curiosity of the PET is that it uses static RAM and not dynamic RAM, or DRAM as we usually call it. Because they were dealing with an incredibly small amount of memory at only 4K in the original config, and because 4K of RAM of any kind was expensive to begin with at the time, they opted to go with static RAM. Well, what's the difference? Well, static RAM...
Ok. Andiamo. Pazzesco. Yeah, what? Ah, ok, gata. Gata că mi-e o brain
RAM
fart.
holds its contents for as long as power is supplied to the chip. Store a number in SRAM and come back an hour later, it's still there. Dynamic RAM, however, requires additional circuitry to continually refresh the contents of the RAM to keep it fresh. Without that refresh, it loses its contents. So static RAM seems preferable, and it is in a number of ways, but it does cost more. On the C64, they would add custom logic to the VEC chip to do the DRAM refresh for them, but there's no comparable chip in the PET, so static RAM avoids the need to do a refresh circuit at all. It's time to jump into the memory map so that we can place everything where it belongs. Being able to see the whole thing as a bird's eye view is invaluable in
Care e
understanding
diferența? Că n-am
fresh
înțeles.
circuitry to continually refresh. An hour later, it's still there. Well, what's the difference? Well, static RAM holds its contents for as long as power is supplied to the chip. Store a number in SRAM and come back an hour later, it's still there. Dynamic RAM, however, requires additional circuitry to continually refresh the contents of the RAM to keep it fresh. Without that refresh, it loses its contents. So static RAM seems preferable, and it is in a number of ways, but it does cost more. On the C64, they would add custom logic to the VEC chip to do the DRAM refresh for them, but there's no comparable chip in the PET, so static RAM avoids the need to do a refresh circuit at all. It's time to jump into the memory map so that we can place everything where it belongs. Being able to see the whole thing as a bird's eye view is invaluable in understanding the entire system. All RAM appears in the memory map starting at address 0. On a 4K PET, your RAM thus appears from 0000 to 0FFF. The PET is built around the 6502 CPU, and that dictates that the first page of memory, known as 0 page, is special. It's essentially a set of 128 16-bit pointers, or you can use them as bytes too, but they're handy as pointers. The second page of memory is also special, as it's the location of the stack. It can't grow outside of that page, so it's limited to 256 bytes. RAM can be added to a limit of 32K max, meaning the top of memory would then be 7 FFF. Regardless of how much system RAM you have, the PET has an additional 1000 bytes of static screen RAM mapped into memory at location 8000. The memory is in addition to the base system RAM, so your 4K PET actually has 5K. Bonus. Above the screen RAM are the ROM sockets. Each one is 4K, except for the ROM at E000, which is only 2K, but more about that one later. At 9000 and A000 are two 4K ROM sockets that are delivered empty on the PET. They're considered expansion ROMs. The biggest problem is that most of the available expansion ROMs all competed for the same address because 6502 code is not relocatable. The addresses for loads and jumps, for example, are hard-coded into it. B000 is another 4K empty ROM socket. I mention it separately only because later PETs that had BASIC 4, which was bigger, contained a ROM in this location. My own machine has indeed been upgraded to BASIC 4, which is why we see a ROM installed in that location in the picture. At C000 and D000, we find two 4K ROMs for Microsoft BASIC. I think it's fairly impressive that BASIC fits in 8K, to be honest. As mentioned, the ROM at E000 is only 2K. That leaves the top half of what would otherwise be a 4K ROM as a 2K block of empty, unused addresses where the system I/O chips are mapped into memory. But in fact, only a single page from E800 to E8FF is actually used. In this area, we find the registers for two peripheral interface adapters, or PIA chips. One is dedicated to the keyboard and cassette ports, while the other is intended for talking to the IEEE bus that early Commodore disk drives would actually use. Next comes the VIA chip, or Versatile Interface Adapter. It primarily controls the user port, timers, and the second cassette interface. There are a number of port registers exposed, and programming it reminds me a lot of programming something like an Arduino Nano in that you set the data direction appropriately and then read and write bits manually. This chip has 16 GPIO lines and half of them are available for your use. Those 8 are exposed at the user port. The most common use of those lines is to implement RS-232C, which is a variant of serial that runs at 5 volts instead of 12 volts. You could use the ports to communicate with a microcontroller, PC, or modem. Given a mental picture of where things live in the memory map, let's now turn our attention to the system mainboard, where you'll discover that there was a method to my madness, as it were, because the physical layout of the mainboard follows the memory map layout in the same order that we just covered it. For example, at the bottom of the board is system RAM. Next above that is the screen RAM. Off to the side of that, because it's not even visible on the system bus, is the character generator ROM. Above that are found the system ROM chips. The CPU and I/O are up near the top of the board in the same way that the I/O chips are near the top of memory. Now that we know all the major components in the system and where they live in the memory map and on the board itself, it's time to ask how they work. When you turn the machine on, how does it know where to start up? Well, for that, we turn to the 6502 datasheet, which tells us how the boot sequence happens. First, the CPU loads the address out of memory at FFFC and FFFD. That's true for every 6502 ever made. It's how everyone starts up, which means that there must be ROM up at the top of memory for it to read, and we saw that in the memory map, the kernel lives up at the top of memory. If we look at the source code for the PET kernel, we can see 3 important vectors at the top of memory. 2 interrupt vectors in addition to our reset vector. The reset vector is set to point at the label start, so let's take a look at that code. The code is fairly straightforward. It initializes a stack pointer, disables interrupts, turns off decimal math mode, and then proceeds to initialize I/O and get the system running before it hands control off to the screen editor and basic interpreter. But what is the kernel? Well, just as the BIOS is a set of routines that allows the operating system to communicate with and control the underlying hardware of a PC, the kernel routines provide all of the system-specific functionality that BASIC needs to get its job done. If you've ever called JSR FFD2 on the C64 to output a character to the screen, that's an example of a kernel call. On the PET, the goal was strictly to provide a set of routines that would provide Microsoft with a way to access the Commodore hardware, screen editor, and so on. It wouldn't truly become a public system API, well organized and so on, until the VIC-20. Clearly, the bulk of the functionality that the PET provides is thanks to the code included in the kernel and BASIC ROMs. I should be clear that I'm lumping the screen editor in with the kernel. In fact, the delineation is really more practically between Commodore code and Microsoft code. One important feature that I assume found itself on the Commodore list of things to do was the keyboard scanning routine. The ROM code uses one of the PIA chips to talk to the keyboard as a matrix. Several times per second, the ROM cycles between rows 1 to 10 in the keyboard. That binary number is sent to a decoder chip with 10 lines, and those lines are used one at a time to power rows on the keyboard. If the signal from row 8 comes back on column 3, then the system knows exactly which key is pressed. Let's say the key in question is the E key. The code for E, which is 5, is then stored at the position in screen memory that the current cursor position is at. Then the cursor is updated by moving it right one position, which will update the position values down in 0 page. The screen editor was provided by Commodore and was quite innovative for its day. Rather than accumulating a single line of input and then executing it when you pressed enter, the PET went about it in a very unique way. You could type anywhere on the screen. When the ready prompt emerged, the cursor would be placed directly below it, but you were free to use the cursor keys to move the cursor anywhere and type anything. Only when you pressed enter did the system snap to attention and attempt to execute something. Whatever line the cursor happened to be on would be passed entirely to the basic interpreter. So, if you could enter a line like 10 go to 20, and then you realize later that you made an error, instead of retyping or editing the line, you could actually simply just cursor back up to it and change the 20 to a 30. As long as you pressed enter on that line, the new version would be committed and passed to the basic interpreter. It would see the line number and replace the line 10 with the new version that you had just submitted. This explains why, when you press enter on a screen line that contains the ready prompt, it dutifully reports out of data error. The reason? Well, you've pressed enter on the text ready, which thus gets passed to the basic interpreter. It sees the command as read Y, but when it tries to execute it, no matching data statements have yet been executed, so there's no data to be read. Want to verify that? Well, try it after providing a data 10 line and then removing the period at the end. It will read Y from your data statement and you can print Y to confirm it. Let's have a quick look at the basic ROM to see what's included within it. Of course, it has the tokenizing basic interpreter, but it has many support routines that you can make use of, including a very optimized floating point math library. Let's have a quick look at how to call the math libraries on the PET. Imagine we want to add two 16-bit quantities and then print the result. First, we need to load an integer quantity into the floating point accumulator. There are two such accumulators, which are really just memory addresses used as storage by the math routines. To load our value into the first one, we put the least significant byte into the Y register and the upper byte into the A register. We then call int fp, and our 16-bit floating point accumulator is loaded from these two 8-bit registers. Next, we would move the value from fact1 to fact2 using the fact12 function, and then load the second value just as we did the first using int fp. Next, we simply call add, and the accumulator 1 is now the sum of accumulator 1 and accumulator 2. We can then call fpout to print the result to the console. There's more to it, like Commodore's I/O system of devices and channels, but quite honestly, it's largely the same as what you do through Commodore BASIC. The only catch is that some commands take more arguments than you have registers, and as a result, basic commands like open get broken down into a couple of discrete steps. You load the device number and the file number in one step and call listen, and then second to set the secondary address. We've covered a great deal, from the video system and I/O chips to two types of RAM, as well as the major sections of ROM, kernel, and BASIC. And yet even so,
abstractizare acum. Ca să nu-și facă lumea probleme cu astea.
But those things are really quite specific to the PET itself. We covered everything you need to make a working computer with a CRT and a keyboard interface, and that's the main goal that I set out to accomplish today. If I've made any mistakes, which is almost inevitable in an episode like this, where it'll be seen by people that know more than I do about the subject, please do let me know, and I'll update the description with any errata. If you don't see any, that means I achieved perfection. If you enjoyed this little intense tour,
I've solved a lot of LeetCode problems. Hey guys, I'm still unemployed, so let's solve another LeetCode problem. And eventually got an offer from Google, where I've interviewed over a dozen candidates. After hundreds of hours of grinding and explaining problems, I learned there are different levels of preparation. And I'll share everything I know about the process, including how to practice, how many problems you should solve, common mistakes to avoid, and whether I think LeetCode is a total waste of time. Like most people, I started with easy questions. I used C++ because it was the first language I learned, but this was a bit of a mistake, and unfortunately I didn't learn so until later on. Initially, I wasn't even able to solve the easy problems. Even if I knew the solution, I would always get tripped up by edge cases. I wasn't an expert in data structures and algorithms. I mainly knew the basics like arrays, linked lists, hash maps, trees, sorting, and binary search. And honestly, I think that's pretty much enough before you actually start solving problems, because a lot of the easy problems will solidify your understanding of the basics. And 50 problems problems later, that's where I was. I could solve a lot of the trivial problems like reversing a string or inverting a binary tree, but I hadn't even touched a graph problem and I didn't even know what dynamic programming was. But believe it or not, 50 problems was enough for me to get an internship at a bank. But I knew I had to keep grinding if I wanted to get a job at a big tech company. So I continued to solve problems in a random order, which was another mistake, but probably 60 or 70 questions in, I switched to Python. I would always look at the LeetCode Discuss section and I saw that Python code was always the shortest and most concise, even though I had never used Python before, and still to this date, I've never used Python at any job or internship. It was an easy choice to make because you don't have to learn the entire language. You really just have to learn the basic syntax, how to write if statements, for loops, and all the standard data structures and methods. And you can actually learn these as you solve LeetCode problems just by Googling as
e
needed.
bun, da, nu
Now,
știu,
C++
pe alea de lead code.
isn't a bad
Sunt mai
choice either,
simple.
but I would definitely avoid a verbose language like Java. The language probably won't be a deal breaker, but it can definitely save you a few minutes when you're
Da,
typing
Java
out
și-ar
your
uita
code,
și eu
which
că
can
n-are
definitely
toate
make a difference in a
structurile de
real
date.
interview. But it doesn't matter how fast you type if you can't actually solve the problem.
Care le
And
are
even
stilul din
after
C++.
solving 100 problems, while I had learned all of the high-value algorithms like DFS, BFS, sliding window, and backtracking, I wasn't able to consistently solve a new problem for the first time. I didn't know it then, but the reason was that a lot of LeetCode questions are sequential. You've probably seen questions like House Robber 1, House Robber 2, and House Robber 3. Obviously, you should solve these questions in order, but actually most of LeetCode questions should be solved in a specific order. For example, you should never try solving dynamic programming problems unless you already have a solid understanding of backtracking. And you probably shouldn't try solving graph problems until you have a solid understanding of trees. This is obvious in hindsight, but I'm sure a lot of people make this mistake, which is why I created a roadmap so that you don't make the same mistake I did. It turns out that the order you solve problems in does matter. I also think that solving 1 or 2 problems a day
Roadmap, ia să vedem.
consistently is a lot better than cramming because the ideas will
Secundă. Ia să vedem roadmap, NeetCode.io. Ce site e ăsta, NeetCode? Și Video Solution. Drăguțel, drăguțel. Ok, asta se reține. Courses. C5. Gratis. Rău site-ul deloc. Chiar nu e rău deloc. Get process și asta, păi de prefer coding. Ce conține? Încă la inițiativa asta când publică chestii? O lună. 2 luni. Da, interesant site-ul. Ia să reținem și să mai facem chestii de aici. Punem să trebuiască să fac categorie 19 pentru
will actually stick. If you need a little motivation, I've been solving daily LeetCode problems on my second channel. As I continued, I realized that if I couldn't solve a question in 45 to 60 minutes, I wasn't going to be able to solve it myself. Previously, I would literally bang my head against the wall for 3 to 4 hours on a single problem because I thought that was the only way to learn. But let's just be honest, most of us are not going to be able to come up with some of these complex academic algorithms by ourselves. And even if you can come up with Floyd's tortoise and hare algorithm, it's probably not an efficient use of your time. There's no shame in looking at a solution as long as you can understand exactly why it works. That's why in my videos, I really try to explain my thought process behind every problem. This ended up saving me a lot of time because I would get to a really hard problem, a crackhead problem I like to call them, like burst balloons, and I would get pretty close to solving the problem. I would know it's a dynamic programming problem, but I just couldn't figure out the trick behind it. Then I would look at a solution solution, and only after 5 minutes of reading I would
Wait,
realize the
what?
trick behind it. Then
Stai
I
așa.
would look.
What? Only Rio cache none. The fuck is that? Python. Rio cache. Ce e asta, bă? Să mor tu că poți să faci asta. Memory callable the same as insect time when expensive for an experience calling the same arguments. Oh, să mor. Wow. Mamă, bă, asta e LOL. Nu știam de asta. Asta e science fiction. Să dai memoizare cu un decorator în Python.
Look at a
Wow.
solution, and only after 5 minutes of reading I would realize, oh,
Smart.
that's the trick, and then I would be able to immediately solve the problem. I was able to go from 100 to 250 solved questions a lot faster than I was able to solve my first 100 questions. And by then, I had learned 99% of the patterns that I needed, even some of the complex ones. And I got to the point that writing out these algorithms
Și
like
după lucrezi la
DFS,
aplicația
BFS,
de
and binary search
ceas
was as
de la Google.
easy for me as writing a for loop. Even some advanced ones like union find, Dijkstra's, I could write out in less than 5 minutes. And that's when I realized that most LeetCode problems fall into these buckets. For medium questions, you just need to figure out what algorithm you need and then apply it. Hard questions are similar, except there's usually a really complex trick behind them. And sometimes, unless you've seen it before, only God can help you figure it out. Or maybe your interviewer if they happen to be generous. At this point, I was confident I could pass interviews, but I wasn't 100% sure if I was ready for the big tech interviews like Google or Facebook. And spoiler alert, you will probably never feel 100% prepared. It's not a binary decision whether you are ready for an interview or not, because you never know which questions you're going to be asked. It's more of a distribution. You might have a 50% chance of passing, or you might get to the point where you have a 90% chance of passing. If you're a perfectionist, I'm sure you want 100% chance, but that's almost never going to be the case. I think a good rule of thumb is that you should be able to solve a medium problem that you've never seen before in 20 to 25 minutes. If you can do that, you probably have at least an 80% chance of passing most FANG interviews. And I continue to solve up to 569 problems, even though I had already gotten into Google, mostly because I'm a loser. But it's not quite as time consuming as you might think, because I've gotten to the point that I can solve most medium questions in 10 to 15 minutes.
No.
But I definitely don't recommend it because there are diminishing returns on solving more and more problems. I think quality is much better than quantity. I recommend solving about 150 questions, like the NeetCode 150 list, which has video solutions and code solutions in 14 languages, but make sure you really understand each and every problem. A huge mistake that most people make is that they don't go back and review previous problems. For these complex algorithms to really sink in, you need repetition. That's why I'm working on taking each problem from the NeetCode 150 list and converting it into a multiple choice quiz, because it's really hard to go back and re-solve each question, and usually all you need to do is review the trick. So I made quizzes that you should be able to solve in a few minutes, but also get a lot of value from it. You can check out a handful of problems right now, but when the list is complete, ideally you should be able to go through it in just a single day. I think this will be a huge time saver for people. So after all that, is LeetCode just a big waste of time? Yes, if you're trying to learn about development and actually building applications, LeetCode probably isn't going to help you do that. But people will spend thousands of hours getting a CS degree to get a decent paying job, but won't spend an extra 100 hours to get a big compensation bump. It doesn't really make sense to me. Don't get me wrong, LeetCode isn't the most exciting thing in the world, but I do think it helps you think about edge cases and how you would unit test your code. These are skills that can be applied to application development. And believe it or not, algorithms and data structures are widely used in industry, from database engines to compilers. But it's true that LeetCode won't teach you everything. That's where Taro comes in. It's a YC-backed platform to help you grow in your tech career, including helping you onboard as quickly as possible and get you a faster promotion. production, using master
What?
classes with experienced.
Aro, ce dracu mă site mai ești ăsta? Că au făcut numai site-uri. Aici. Deja au stack de site-uri acum să înveți programare, cică. Aro. IT. Nu știu. Aro ăsta. Pricing, evident că nu-i mă. Ah. Okay. Aro.
Tech leads and leaders. You can check it out using the link in the description and
Am
use
aflat de
code
site-ul ăla măcar. Interesant asta cu NIT codul. Și astea gen când intri pe ele. Ah, ok. Da. Tasty. Tasty. Nu sunt și probleme direct pe... Probleme direct de pe lead code? Să sunt curios. Da, context duplicates. Problema 150 o găsesc. Asta voiam. Pam. Am logat pe asta de groază. GitHub parcă. Hai mă. Doar. Tot am o problemă. Aici. Contains duplicate. Da, sunt fix astea. Cool.
Code for 20.
Next. Toată o chestie. Yeah, when you compare
When you think PC speakers, you probably think of something that looks like this.
But
the original PC speaker actually looked more like this. The original IBM PC from 1981 actually had a speaker built into the chassis, and unlike modern computer speakers, it would typically only emit a series of beeps and boops, kind of like R2-D2, but without the fun personality. And even though many of you probably aren't old enough to remember using the original IBM PC, plenty of subsequent systems featured a similar PC speaker. If you remember hearing a beep coming from your PC chassis when you booted it up, that was the PC speaker in action. Indeed, from the mid-1990s onward, the primary use of the PC speaker was to relay information about system operations to the user. It was common for a beep at boot up to mean that the computer had passed the power on self-test, or post, while multiple beeps, or no beep at all, indicated some kind of error or hardware problem. But prior to the mid-90s, the PC speaker was actually used for general sound output, music playback, feedback from productivity applications, or sound effects in video games. So, similar to the full-fat speakers of today, just with a much more limited range of sounds. But why was it so limited? Well, most speakers work by having a diaphragm move from some starting position to some end position, with the movement of the diaphragm pushing the air to make what our ears register as sound. Normally, speakers receive analog input, a voltage that tells them how far to move, a big wiggle or a little wiggle. The old PC speaker, though, could be told to either be all the way in or all the way out. Quickly switching between these two positions at a regular interval makes something close to a single frequency tone. And yet, this system could produce a wider range of sounds somehow. We'll tell what clever technique was used to change the notes and create more complicated music or sound effects right after we thank the sponsor of this video,
Modulare, no?
Internet Access. Their VPN network spans across 6 easy to run and they 30-day money-back guarantee was used to expand a technique called pulse width modulation, or
Easy.
was used to expand the capabilities of the PC speaker. You might be more familiar with PWM as a method to vary the speed of fans in your computer, but it also worked well for the PC speaker. It worked by essentially applying voltages for varying lengths of time, which resulted in the speaker being told to switch between in and out faster than it could physically respond. You see, it takes time for the speaker to change states between in and out. It's a very short amount of time, we're talking far lower than a millisecond, but it still takes time nonetheless. So if a signal is sent to change back before the speaker is fully finished switching states, different kinds of sounds can be produced. Although the sounds you'd get in many games and applications were still fairly simple, talented programmers could exploit this method in some games to allow for the playback of more complex music and even human speech. The downside, though, is that this often put quite a load on CPUs of the day, so not all systems were powerful enough to reproduce the best that the dinky little speaker had to offer. Of course, once dedicated sound cards started making their way into PCs, taking that load off of the CPU, we all started connecting proper desktop speakers to our computers, and the PC speaker was mostly relegated back to its original role of just beeping at us every now and then. And even that isn't as common these days, since modern applications can give you auditory feedback through, actual speakers. And there are more robust tools for diagnostics between Windows features, the UEFI, and even indicator lights and LED codes on the motherboard itself. Some motherboards don't even have headers for an internal speaker anymore. But if you really miss that sweet startup beep, you can actually buy an M.2 gadget that makes a similar sound, which originated from an old NEC PC98, if you can wait for it to be shipped from Japan. Do you still use the internal PC speaker in your modern setup? Let us know down below, and if you want to know why
Okay. Interesant video. Titlul e cam scos din context. Scurt. Cu Elder Scrolls-ul. Scoate momentan pe pauză. Hai să vedem asta din Draft Shampoo.
This is what your hair looks like when it's dirty.
And this is what shampoo does to that dirt.
Surfactants form these micelles around the dirt, which is what grabs onto the dirt and oil. It's like, no, I don't want to go. That was the dirt screaming for its life.
Erica Douglas has been a cosmetic chemist for more than a decade, and today she's going to break down the ingredients in Head & Shoulders Classic Clean Dandruff Shampoo.
It's about to get messy. It's actually a fairly simple formula, not a lot of ingredients. That means that there's not a lot of fluff in this formula.
Erica broke down the ingredients into these categories. Let's start here.
One of the first ingredients I see is pyrithione zinc. This is one of the most common actives used in the cosmetic space to fight dandruff. Without this ingredient, it's just a shampoo. Dandruff is actually caused by a fungus called Malassezia, and it feeds on the oil.
The FDA allows up to 2% of pyrithione zinc in products like this shampoo, which are applied and then rinsed off.
Pyrithione zinc. Ia mă, stați așa că aduc șamponul aici. Să vedem aici ce. Pyrithione zinc-ul ăsta. Suntem aici cu șamponul. Deci ce avem în el? Aqua, sodium lauret, sulfat, sodium nu știu ce, cocamide, guarhidro, ai de capul meu. Astea. Citric acid, sodium, ce, metriloclos, par, n-am bă ce să. Așa. Pyrithione zinc, ce? Păi și fără asta e degeaba? Sunt. E de știut și, da. Ce chestii mai sunt?
The clean formula uses pyrithione zinc at 1%, but in the EU,
Astea. Good.
They actually banned pyrithione zinc from being used as a cosmetic active.
According to the company, the EU version uses this ingredient instead of pyrithione zinc.
Pirocton, olamin. Ia mă. Nici ăla n-are. Ok.
So the active ingredient handles the dandruff, but surfactants like these sulfates are what actually clean the scalp.
Surfactants are the soapy part of the shampoo. It's what causes the suds. It's actually what is pulling the dirt and the oil off of your hair and scalp. I believe that they are using this as their primary surfactant, and the cocamidopropylbutane is the secondary surfactant.
Asta, cocami, da. Apare aici. Citisem mai devreme. Cocamid mea. Acolo și sodium laurel. Da.
In this formula.
Surfactants work a little something like this.
We're going to just use some regular pepper, have it float on top of some normal deionized water. These surfactants have their hydrophilic head and their hydrophobic tails. And so they form these micelles around the dirt, which is what grabs onto the dirt and oil and helps it to remove it from the hair and the scalp. Instantly, you see how it repels it. It's like running from the shampoo.
Some surfactants create more suds than others, but
Foam
actually doesn't dictate how well a shampoo is cleaning your hair. There are certain surfactants that can produce a lot of foam, like this one, but then there are other surfactants that can produce a lot of foam, like this one. But then there are other surfactants that are more mild. Does not mean that it's not working. So foam is kind of like for aesthetics. And we call this the cylinder shake method. You can see how much foam is going to last and how it separates out. A lot of hairstylists view sulfates as being too harsh. I see sulfates as a great surfactant when used in moderation, and they are also being formulated in conjunction with other conditioning agents that allow it to moisturize and condition the hair at the same time.
That's the job of this ingredient here, otherwise known as a silicone.
They help to maintain the water level in your hair. This is water with just a little bit of violet 1 colorant versus when I do the same thing with dimethicone. And dimethicone just has a little bit of the blue 1 colorant. You notice how the water went right through the sponge. That's because it soaked in and went straight to the bottom. Versus this silicone stayed right on top. This is the difference between when your hair is absorbing moisture versus using a silicone like dimethicone to help seal the cuticle and maintain moisture content. Silicones have really gotten this bad rep. They've been thought to weigh the hair down or leave a buildup. This is absolutely not true. They have the ability to stay on the hair, to seal the cuticles, and they do come off the hair when using a shampoo.
Now, for what gives the shampoo its distinct look.
So Head & Shoulders uses blue number 1 and red 33 as their colorants. And that's how you get this really cool light blue looking color. In addition to the glycol distearate, which is used as a pearlizing agent to give it that pearl look. I don't know what the ratios are that they use. That's their proprietary information. First, I'm gonna start with my blue number 1. Ooh, okay. And then we'll try to see what happens when we add a little red 33. As you can see, I literally put less than a gram in, and that's how dark it got.
Blue 1 and red 33 are both synthetic colors approved for use in cosmetics, with some use restrictions.
Some of the concerns that come around synthetic colors would be that it could potentially be an irritant or an allergen for some people.
According to the Environmental Working Group's safety ratings, blue 1 is marked as high hazard, while red 33 is marked as moderate. A Head & Shoulders representative reiterated that these dyes are FDA approved, noting that the Classic Clean formula is known for its signature blue color. And when it comes to fragrance,
it just lists that they use fragrance, nothing else. Fragrance contains 30, 40 ingredients sometimes. The ingredients that make up a fragrance are often proprietary.
But according to Erica's scientific sniffer,
product has floral and aquatic notes.
While it's not listed on the label, Head & Shoulders does list over 20 ingredients found in the Classic Clean fragrance formulation online, including some considered allergens in the EU. And soon, this could become a more common practice.
A new law was put into action, which actually will now require cosmetic products to list fragrance allergens on the label going into 2024.
Consistency is also a crucial part of a shampoo's formulation.
Some of the ingredients that they're using to give that thick, creamy feel is glycol distearate, also the guar, hydroxypropyl trimodium chloride. Guar is a great conditioning, detangling agent, but it also gives the formula some thickness. With salt, can give you that thick feel.
And while the final product feels thick,
the most surprising thing about shampoo formulations is that it's mostly water. Any product that has water in it has the potential to grow mold, fungus, bacteria. We don't want any of that stuff.
Different packages the Wall Street Journal purchased had different preservatives listed.
Yeah.
The preservative used in this product is sodium benzoate.
Another version of the same product lists these 2 additional preservatives, which have a high incidence with skin allergies. The company said it recently shifted away from this preservative combination to one with sodium benzoate, but products with the combination are still currently sold on store shelves. Before a product hits the shelf, one crucial element must be tested. That's the pH.
We are measuring a pH of 7.3 for this Head & Shoulders product. This is not abnormal, but it is on the high end of what I would normally see.
Head & Shoulders said this reading is in line with the standard range of its formulas, which it said remains America's #1 anti-dandruff shampoo, with moisture levels as they are. And there are a few things to note on the overall packaging.
They claim that this bottle is paraben-free. I would agree that this is a paraben-free product. The paraben issue is a very provocative topic. There have been some preliminary studies that show that there could be possible linkage between parabens and cancer. There's no conclusive scientific data that links paraben usage in cosmetics directly to cancer, but the possibilities of it being a carcinogen has provoked some limitations on how this ingredient is being used in the cosmetic space.
And Erica sees some opportunities for improvements.
If I could change anything about this formula, I would probably add a few more conditioning and moisturizing agents just to give more functionality and more control to the actual hair. I think that dandruff is a little hush-hush because nobody wants to be known as the snowflake. I think a lot of people associate dandruff with being unclean, but that's completely not true. We need to talk more about it.
Asta chiar a fost mișto, mamă. Lol. Asta chiar a fost mișto. Mai avem multe. Cred că o să facem numai zi de... LOL, să mor tu că... Holy shit. Să mut asta, what the fuck. Citat. Mai avem multe și... Cred că o să facem duminica zi de proiecturi de-astea. Mâine noapte apare expansional la cred că se facă. Adică noaptea asta, teoretic. Noaptea spre marți. Bine zis. Saturday să fac. Reforged. Da, interesant. Avem multe de văzut, tot ce mai găsesc pe aici și îmi recomandă. Se bagă la Watch Later pentru viitoare. Ciao.